Welcome back. The President's Day holiday is intended to be a time to remember and celebrate the historic contributions of presidents past. Among them, Abe Lincoln, who brought the country through a civil war, fought over the issue of slavery. Literally thousands of biographies have been written about him, but what do we really know about Lincoln? Well, the 4-part Apple Plus series called Lincoln's Dilemma hopes to shed new light on the life of the 16th president.
Abraham Lincoln has outwitted just about as many historians as politicians of his own day. Unless you understand what is going on around what he is saying, you can never really understand Abraham Lincoln.
Lincoln did not start his presidency to be the great emancipator.
It's not a phrase Lincoln asked to be applied to himself, and we can do better.
Frederick Douglass is every bit the equal of the President of the United States.
He's constantly in Lincoln's ear, pushing him on Black humanity.
As the voices that have access to Lincoln change, Lincoln himself changes in response.
And joining me now is historian David Reynolds, author of Abraham Lincoln in His Times. The Apple TV Plus series Lincoln's Dilemma is based on his award-winning book. David Reynolds, thank you for joining us. I understand you went to school in our area and grew up in Rhode Island, so it's nice to have you join us here on Cityline today.
Great to be with you. Yeah, I grew up in Barrington, Rhode Island, and then I went to college in Massachusetts. So, yeah.
So let's talk about your book. Now, your biography of Lincoln gives us a fuller sense of Lincoln, the man. Tell us more about what you learned about the times in which he lived and the culture that shaped him.
Yeah, he grew up in a very rough, crude environment where there was a lot of drunkenness and fighting and so forth on the frontier in Kentucky and Indiana. Fortunately, he was a very, very good fighter, although he didn't like to fight dirty, but he could sort of beat anybody in wrestling. And that exposed him to kind of the common man, so to speak. And then in the 1830s, he lived in Illinois, and at that time there were so many political riots. He called America a mobocracy. And he tried to bring along reason and persuasion and judiciousness to this turbulent culture. And then, of course, later, when the country became totally divided over slavery, it was at that point that he really had to use his tactfulness, his humor, his leadership qualities to try to stabilize the country as much as possible when it was so divided that there was this tremendous bloody civil war in which nearly 800,000 Americans died.
David, what was it about Lincoln's northern and southern lineage and ancestry and upbringing that shaped his views on slavery and prepared him for his presidency?
Well, he was descended on his father's side to early Puritan New England, which was considered to be the source of anti-slavery thought, and on his mother's side to a Virginia planter who represented the Southern Cavalier, the kind of pro-slavery side. So these qualities kind of melded in him and made him a very, very good kind of diplomat, someone who could cross the aisle and someone who could see both sides. He said, you know, if we lived down south, we'd probably feel the same way about slavery, but he had a certain compassion, and I think his ancestry from two sides fed into that very much.
You know, David, in the Black community, Lincoln is known as the president that freed the slaves. And in fact, much of history focuses on that aspect of Lincoln's legacy. But ending enslavement was much more of a complex dilemma for Lincoln, wasn't it?
Yes. Lincoln always hated slavery. He wanted to free the slaves. However, he lived in a nation that was large, even in the North, that was largely racist, and he had to win votes along the way. And sometimes he had to walk a political tightrope and stay kind of balanced in the center, and sometimes even lean to the right a little bit just to win votes. However, the film shows that Frederick Douglass and other African Americans were really his strong conscience. They were always in his ear in a very, very good sense, and reminding him to kind of keep on that general course of emancipation.
And in fact, in the Apple series, Lincoln's Dilemma, the words of abolitionist Frederick Douglass were narrated by actor Leslie Odom Jr. Tell us more about the relationship between Douglass and Lincoln.
Douglass was the leading African-American reformer of the time, a marvelous speaker, very magnetic. At first, early in the Civil War, Douglass was a little uncertain about Lincoln because Lincoln wasn't immediately directing the war toward emancipation. Why? Lincoln said, you know, if I lose one of the border states, those were states that had slaves and yet they were loyal to the Union, at any moment they could topple into the Confederacy. If I lose one of them, we're just going to have to give up immediately. So he just couldn't direct it immediately toward emancipation of the enslaved people. And Douglass got a little frustrated about that, but he met with Lincoln a couple of times during the war, became closer and closer to him, and ultimately realized that Lincoln looked slow and lethargic on slavery and yet was radical and swift given the temper of the times and given the fragility of the nation, the Union, which could fall apart. Even the North, there were a lot of protests against Lincoln in the North because there was a lot of racism. So he had to be very, very cautious. But Douglass ended up being very, feeling very close to Lincoln. And he called Lincoln ultimately the least prejudiced white person that I've ever actually met in person. So that was interesting.
Can you share with us any other things that you learned about Lincoln's friendships with or knowledge of African Americans that also might have shaped some of his views?
He lived in Springfield before he went to Washington in a neighborhood that had more than 20 African Americans living within about 3 or 4 blocks to him. And he became really personally quite close to several of them. And one of them named Floraville sent him a very affectionate letter in the White House, and another one went to Washington with him and helped to serve him and so forth. And in the course of the war, he got to meet not only Frederick Douglass, but also the feminist Sojourner Truth, an African American who came to visit him, and she was delighted to meet him. And then Martin Delany, who was actually very radical. He's sometimes compared to Malcolm X. But when he met Lincoln, he was just totally impressed. And when Lincoln died, Martin Delany just cried like a baby, cried like a baby. And he was very, very impressed. And I think that what the movie shows, the documentary shows, is that Lincoln was also very much inspired by the performance of African-American troops. There are 180,000 African-American troops, and Lincoln was genuinely inspired and indebted to the African-American troops.
David Reynolds, thanks for joining us today to give us a glimpse into a different side of Abraham Lincoln. Again, your book is called Abe, Abraham Lincoln in His Times, and there are 4 episodes of Lincoln's Dilemma available for viewing now on Apple TV. Take care.
Thank you.